bit of preview on some of the things that Nonprofit Vote is working on. Of course, we'll have updates for you all year round, new resources that we've created, returning resources that have been updated for this year, because those things always need to get updated, and initiatives, programs, partnership opportunities that we hope you will take advantage of and get really involved in. After we go through that, we're going to look at what has changed since 2020. Lots of new laws, new maps. Then we have our guest panelists. We'll have Kevin Shankar Sinha from Civic Georgia and Cheryl Carter from Democracy North Carolina joining us. And then, of course, we'll have your audience Q&A. So please use that Q&A box if you have any questions for me or for our speakers today. If you would like, we would love to have you introduce yourself in the chat. So feel free to do that. And we'll get started with the content for today. So year in preview. So I came on to Nonprofit Vote in early 2018. I think 4 days from now will make my 4-year anniversary here. And so I've been doing all these webinars, and I'm excited to continue doing webinars. And maybe for the first time ever, I have them scheduled in advance. So keep an eye on the chat box, because Kimberly will be sending the links for those. So the first big thing that I want to share with you is a report that we just released last week called America's Nonprofits Get Out the Vote. We took a research question from the Urban Institute's study of thousands of nonprofits, and and of the ones that answered a question about voter engagement, we were able to pull so many findings out of just like this one, starting with this one question. We really wanted to figure out how many nonprofits are doing voter engagement, right? We have a big newsletter list. We know thousands of nonprofits participate in National Voter Registration Day every year, but we didn't have quite a full picture. So what's exciting about this report is that we've been able to figure out that about 20% of nonprofits overall, and we're talking about particularly human service nonprofits, civic engagement and advocacy nonprofits, and even arts and education nonprofits, excluding those, big higher education nonprofits, large hospitals, and really looking at, I think, what an average person might think of on a day-to-day of a nonprofit, like serving their community. And we found some interesting characteristics that those nonprofits that do engage voters seem to share. So here's just a little taste. If you haven't seen that report yet, not very surprising, we found that nonprofits that primarily engage underrepresented communities, they're more likely to do voter engagement. So the nonprofits that said they were serving Black communities, Hispanic communities, and low-income communities all had higher rates of voter engagement than those nonprofits that said they served a general audience, or that population wasn't a group of focus for them. So this is just a teaser. So if you're interested in more graphs and information like this, please check out the report, and you can register for the webinar. It'll be Thursday, March 10th at 2 p.m. And I believe we're going to have the link for that show up in the chat in a moment. So we will have Lindsay Chirico of United Way Worldwide and Jen Matsoukas of Cal Nonprofits, along with other speakers joining for that webinar. All right. Oh, and thank you, Kimberly. She just got the link to that webinar in the chat. And of course, you'll get emails about it if you don't catch it right now. So after we have our nonprofits get out the vote report webinar, we will be really looking at making a plan. It's not too early, and some may argue it's almost getting a little late to plan your 2022 voter engagement activities, but it's okay because we make it really easy for you. In addition to the webinar, where we will really dive into various strategies, ideas for different activities you can use, ways to really engage the people that you're serving by integrating voter engagement into the services and interactions you're already having with them. We also have tons of resources that help you make that plan and also engage your staff, your volunteers. Nonprofits have a large network. There's so many people that we can really reach through our voter engagement efforts. And so let's just plan them out so that we have for the whole year, April through November, a solid plan to make sure that folks are #vote ready. And speaking of #vote ready, it's a little bit in the future, but it's everyone's favorite day of the year, I'm pretty sure, National Voter Registration Day. So save the date. This year, it'll be on Tuesday, September 20th. Some folks might have noticed that this is not the fourth Tuesday of September, and it's typically the fourth Tuesday of September. But we picked this date so that we could be inclusive of more folks and not have it fall on a Jewish holiday, which it has in the past. So September 20th, mark your calendars. I believe in May, we will open up the partner sign up form so that you can sign up to get those posters and stickers. And in the meantime, you can also just sign up for the NVRD newsletter so that you're staying up to date with anything going on. And if you just cannot wait to have that, that civic engagement, registering voters, warm, fuzzy feeling. Luckily, the folks at NVRD have created the One Reg at a Time podcast. So you can take a listen to that. I just listened to the most recent episode with Erica Anthony from our partner at Cleveland Votes. And it was a really great podcast, really interesting conversation with James Hill, our communications director. And I hope that people will give it a little listen and tide you over until we get to September 20th. All right, so now that I've just zoomed through some of the things that you can look forward to over the year, let's look backwards. In November 2020, we had a momentous election. People were voting, starting in October with huge early voting rates, huge mail-in ballot rates, the highest participation in an election in this country in over a century. So that was really exciting. And it was also, of course, in the midst of a life-changing pandemic that really changed the way elections are administered in this country. And a lot of great reforms that only a couple states had been sort of trying out and finding a lot of success with, like expanded mail voting, that really took off across the country, and we saw tons of states increasing the opportunities for people to vote by mail. Now, since that election, of course, laws have changed in both directions, where some states have made permanent some of those lowered barriers to mail voting or other reforms that just made it easier for people to vote and gave them more options. And some states have swung the other direction and really made their laws more restrictive around voting. And so we're going to hear about that with Kevin in particular about what's happening in Georgia. But just to give us a picture of just how much has changed, according to the Brennan Center, between January 1st and December 7th, at least 25 states enacted 62 laws that expand voting access. So expansive laws include more early voting, easier mail voting, easier voter registration, greater access for people with disabilities, greater access to languages and translations, and the restoration of voting rights. And there were others. This isn't an exhaustive list. This is just my favorite of the many kinds of expansive laws that were enacted. On the other hand, 19 states passed 34 restrictive laws, and these are things like making it more difficult to vote by mail, whether that means there's a shorter amount of time that you can request a mail ballot, a shorter period around delivering that ballot, fewer places to drop it off, new requirements around signatures or IDs to either request the ballot or have the completed ballot be successfully counted. It's gotten a lot harder to vote by mail in many states. Some states have taken on harsher ID requirements, so that if you do not have the correct form of ID at the polls, you could be turned away or forced to vote a provisional ballot. There are some aggressive voting list changes. So that can include when an elections department will purge or remove names of voters because they have not been active in a long time. And so some folks may be, they voted in the last presidential election, or they voted 4 years ago, 6 years ago. They assume they're still on the list because they haven't moved, but in fact, they've been removed from that list. There are also some laws that have made it more difficult for organizations like nonprofits to register voters, and even places where snacks and water have been banned in terms of like giving them out to voters to help them, stay in long lines. So a lot happened in 2021 with laws. And on this next slide, we have a map, which I'm a very visual person. So seeing this, you have the states that are in gray, just as of, December 2021, hadn't enacted changes to the voting process as far as what the Brennan Center is tracking. You see the light blue is only restrictive laws. The medium blue is only expansive laws. So we see a lot of states up in the Northeast, including Massachusetts, where I am, with expansive laws. And then we even see in these dark blue, a handful of states that have done both. They've passed some laws that make it easier to vote and others that make it a little more challenging. And of course, it has not stopped. Most state houses are back in session now. And so far in 2022, there have been a lot of bills filed and proposed changes. So on the next slide, I have, so we have in 27 states, laws, there are bills to restrict voting. And in 32 states, there are almost 400 bills that expand voting access, right? And so what I found most interesting looking at these numbers is to see the giant leap in the number of pre-filed bills on both sides, both expansive and restrictive, that have been filed compared to 1 year ago, right? So 250 restrictive bills versus 75 over the same period, which is just a couple weeks last year. 399 versus 286. So, changes are going to keep happening, and we're going to keep staying on top of those, tracking those, letting you know how things have changed and what to do in response to those changes. But it's just a good reminder that even though we're talking today about what has changed, This is a reality in progress. The real landscape that voters are going to be contending with voting is going to change. There will be lots of court cases and challenges to these laws. And we really just need to stay on top of things and make sure that we are educating voters about what their options are at the time. All right, so it wasn't just laws, of course, it was maps. So we had the 2020 census. It was pretty late into 2021 by the time the Census Bureau got the data to the different states, and that we learned about which states were losing congressional seats. So of course, congressional redistricting is really important, but let's not lose sight of what's happening on the more state level in the state houses. But looking at the congressional level for now, here's a map from Politico that shows us how many states have already got a new map, and they've completed the redistricting process. So 77% of House districts, the map is set, and I think in most of these states we don't anticipate that there will be, the ones in the blue, that there will be much legal challenges to it. On the other hand, there are all those little gray states, including North Carolina. And so we'll hear from Cheryl Carter about the situation there in a moment. If we can go to the next slide, just some little fast facts. There are 12 states, according to the Politico tracker, that their new maps look like they're going to give a partisan boost to one party or the other when compared to their previous map. So 12 of the 41 states that have completed their maps, the rest of them, there's little to no difference in terms of partisan advantage compared to the map they had leading up to 2022. So there are still 9 states that the map isn't finalized. Either it's moving through the state house or it is being challenged in the courts. And overall, there were 13 states that added or lost a congressional seat, and that includes Texas, although they gained 2 seats. So redistricting is, in many places, is essentially done, but in terms of the country as a whole, we are still in the sort of redistricting fight, and changes will happen, and we'll just have to keep a close eye on all of those. So if you want to keep on top of this for yourself, my recommendations are to use the Politico 2022 redistricting tracker. It's really well laid out, very clear. And to use the Brennan Center for information about how states are changing their voting laws. So those are the two sources that I used for this presentation, and I'm on their websites very frequently and recommend those as resources for you as well. All right, and so now that's enough of me talking. You've heard quite a bit from me. So now I'm really excited to first introduce Cheryl Carter from Democracy North Carolina. Democracy North Carolina has been a long-standing partner of Nonprofit Vote, and we really admire and appreciate all the work that they do. And I'm excited to have Cheryl as a guest panelist today to talk about the organization and some of the challenges that North Carolina is facing, and particularly what's going on with that redistricting map. So Cheryl, thanks for joining us, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. And it is so wonderful to be here and to see all of the people from all across the country, as well as some folks I see here from North Carolina. And as Caitlin mentioned, Democracy North Carolina, we are so pleased and proud of our partnership with Nonprofit Vote and the work that we've been able to accomplish. So with that, I just want to tell you a little bit about who we are and what it is that we do. We are based here in the Triangle in Morrisville, North Carolina, and we are a voting rights organization. We are committed to social and racial justice for North Carolinians, and we do it by combining organizing, research, and advocacy and communications in a way that we're able to strengthen the democratic process and structure so that we can make voting a right that's accessible, fair, and equitable to all North Carolinians. And we know that often Black, Brown, and low wealth individuals have often been disenfranchised from this process. So we specifically work with those communities and work to strengthen the process around that. And our values are rooted in equity, community-based leadership, empathy, and definitely bold action, because we know that change just doesn't just happen miraculously. It takes the people and people power to make those things happen. So whether we're at the General Assembly talking to legislators, or we're holding a rally or a press conference, or we're talking to the State Board of Elections, monitoring the boards of elections all across the 100 counties of North Carolina, or we're on the ground cultivating relationships with the communities around the state, growing leaders, building power, and galvanizing support while we're educating and motivating voters, or we're messaging online through our vast communications team here at Democracy North Carolina. We want to ensure that whatever the barriers, whatever the attacks, whatever may happen, that voters and our supporters have the information they need to ensure that they can participate in the process. And with that, I will pass it back to Caitlin.
Great. Cheryl, can before you run off, let's talk for a second about what's going on in North Carolina in terms of redistricting. So can you give us a sort of mini history lesson of the last year or so?
Of course. So, North Carolina, we stay in the news. I know people are constantly hearing that this attack or that attack may be happening. But currently, since 2020, as Caitlin alluded to, the census data was delayed, which caused a delay in some of our municipal elections for 2021. So in addition to this year, we're holding our primary in May. We also are holding some of our municipal elections from 2021 in May. Then there are going to be some in June, and then there will be some in the fall. So as you can imagine, that really makes our job of getting out the vote, educating voters, and mobilizing voters that much more difficult, because any type of change, anything that's different, even if it's for a good reason, can confuse voters. So it's really, really important, as Caitlin talked about, that we work our plan and plan our work so that we can get the information out and ensure, especially those people who maybe vote infrequently, maybe don't understand all the processes that are involved, that we're able to educate them, we're able to mobilize them, and able to protect their votes. So with that, we are waiting on pins and needles because our legislator drew maps. Were those maps, we pushed back against those. There was a court case where those maps were overturned and were ruled unfair. And they were told, okay, you got to go back to the drawing board. You got to try this again because those maps are racially gerrymandered and they don't work for the people. So we need you to go back to listen to the thousands of comments that the public made around what they'd like to see in the maps. What are the communities of interest? So They submitted new maps on the 18th, and tomorrow we will find out if the court is accepting those maps or if there's going to need to be a next step. So just please stay in tune, follow Democracy NC on Twitter, because as soon as the announcement's out, we'll be making that announcement and you will know exactly what the next steps are.
Great, thank you. I'll let you take a break for a moment now, and but we will have more questions for you in a few moments. So if anyone has questions for Cheryl, please use our Q&A box. But for now, I'm excited to introduce our other guest panelist, Kevin Shankar-Sinha from Civic Georgia. And I know Civic Georgia has been a great National Voter Registration Day partner doing really awesome work. And there have been some changes to Georgia law that have been, often in the news that are making it a little harder to do voter engagement work. So we're glad that an organization like Civic Georgia exists to keep that going. So Kevin, can I ask you to join me and introduce yourself?
Hey guys, are you able to hear me? Perfect. Thank you so much, Caitlin, and thank you to Nonprofit Vote for everything you'll do in general, but also for hosting this webinar and being such a great partner to us over the years. It's kind of interesting to see the different ways we've gotten to collaborate and how you've helped and kind of guided our growth too through, honestly, I mean, can anyone, the past couple of years have just been so intense, of course, in so many ways. So briefly, Civic Georgia is a grassroots organization, and we are working towards equity and justice through and in civic engagement. And our means of achieving this is twofold. We serve one as an advocacy organization, which is meant for the community at large. Our role is to engage, educate, and empower community members to get involved in all forms of advocacy and civic participation, including voting and beyond. And we also serve as a collaborative for community organizers who are working on various issues in communities around Georgia. And our role is to provide a network of ideas, of support, of resources, of commiseration, of celebration, all the things that go into organizing that when you're doing it occasionally solo in your neighborhood, you may not have the same opportunity to engage with folks in that work that may come with being part of a larger organization. So that network opportunity. I'm happy to jump into some of the changes that we experienced here in Georgia since 2020. Caitlin spoke a little bit about some of the legislation that was passed around the country. And I want to say, unfortunately, almost every example Caitlin gave of something negative that had passed and been implemented, I believe almost all of those things were part of the Election Integrity Act that was passed here in Georgia. If you've heard of SB 202, Senate Bill 202, that was the major piece of legislation that eventually turned into the Election Integrity Act. And just as a snapshot, some of the problematic elements of this bill included, and again, Caitlin referenced some of these, but hindrances to how early you can request an absentee or mail-in ballot, how late you can mail that in or get that returned, hindrances to voters who may go to the wrong polling location. So for context, in the past, before this law was passed, in Georgia, if as a voter I went to the polling location that wasn't officially assigned to me, I still had the ability to submit a provisional ballot. And for all intents and purposes, if I followed any of the other requirements around that, my vote would be just as valid as if I had gone to the correct polling location. And last year that changed in Georgia. And basically, if you go to the wrong polling location before 5 p.m., you will be turned away. You will be asked politely to go to the correct polling location, or you will be informed that if you choose to vote provisionally at the polling location that you're at, your vote will not count. And I'm also a poll manager, polling location manager, is in sort of seasonal capacity, and it's a really frustrating and harmful and negative space to be in, to have to tell somebody who has come to the polls, they're physically there, they're ready to vote, that they need to go because of some logistical mishap, or maybe they just didn't realize that their polling location had changed, or whatever the case may be. They now need to actually go, or for all intents and purposes, their vote will not count. That's heartbreaking, and the impact is not great in terms of people being able to participate. Snacks and water to voters in line, we're not allowed to provide that anymore. You know, you'd think that legislation would want to focus on how do we empower local election boards to have staffing and resources to not create lines for voters, but instead, apparently, you know, we want to make sure that they aren't given snacks and water. Again, kind of frustrating. ID requirements for absentee ballot voting, infrastructure and election operation changes, which are not as obvious in a voter going to the poll sense, but are problematic and challenging from a voting rights and access to the ballot sense. For example, the Secretary of State in Georgia used to be the chair of the State Board of Elections, and now that chair is assigned by a majority of the state legislature. And the state legislature also has additional power to do sort of takeovers of county boards if they decide that there are issues. So basically, if you can imagine, the Secretary of State is an elected role in Georgia, and the people vote that person into office, and people across the state vote that person into office. And now some of that office's power has been shifted into an appointee who is appointed by the majority of the state legislature, which obviously that dynamic is very different, right? As opposed to the entire state voting on that role, it now looks like where different geographies are voting for local state senate leaders and locally elected state representatives. So some challenging things there. Voter roll purging. We face challenges, as many places, maybe the entire country, in recruiting and efficiently onboarding poll worker recruits, especially as we all experienced COVID impacting the traditional pool of poll workers, seniors, elderly. That meant that a lot more of us needed to step up and try to serve as poll workers, and that meant that counties who were processing poll worker recruits were now getting massive influxes of applications, and that was challenging all around for people applying, for people processing those applications, for poll worker teams trying to onboard new team members. We've had redistricting changes as well, and continue to experience challenges related to that, and we are continuing to invest a lot of energy and resources into organizing community advocacy for redistricting. If you get a chance, I would highly encourage you to look into the Georgia Redistricting Alliance, which we have done just incredible work. I think if I think back to previous redistricting efforts, it has been just massive community education and involvement around redistricting advocacy. So hearing about the challenges that Cheryl was describing for North Carolina, it resonates a lot, and really you just have to get the community involved, which can be challenging when redistricting is something that doesn't happen as frequently as election participation. It can be challenging when redistricting isn't the easiest concept for folks to connect with in a meaningful way. Like it's challenging to maybe get folks energized about it, but it's just as important, if not more important, than other aspects of protecting our civil rights. And Interestingly, we also, I think in the past couple of years, had a chance as organizers, as community advocates, to really engage business and industry leaders in Georgia and create an environment where it was no longer acceptable to sit on the sidelines when it came to these issues like voting rights that were deeply impacting our communities. So you'll probably sense some of those examples last year. And then what are we doing this year? So primaries are coming up in May. 2022 is a very interesting election year for Georgia, because of course we have the midterms, but we also have a contentious and almost national focus on our governor's race. The incumbent is Governor Brian Kemp, and then Stacey Abrams is also running, as well as some other candidates. And for all of the reasons everyone on this call knows, that is going to be a very interesting and energizing race. And our role as voting rights advocates and as folks working in voter empowerment in Georgia is to capitalize on the record turnout and energy and registration levels that we achieved through the most recent Senate runoffs and presidential election, and combine that with the natural interest that exists in Georgia for this governor's race because of the impact, because of the personalities involved, and just make sure that everybody gets to the polls. And as part of doing that, we want to make sure that, one, people know about the changes to election law. So just like many folks on this call, we have been telling people for the past several years that, hey, here is how elections work, and here are the things you need to know to be able to successfully vote. It's frustrating to need to do that, but it's part of our role, right? We live in a society where that level of information needs to be shared. And for example, one of the mantras of voting rights in Georgia was, hey, if you go to the polls and you happen to go to the wrong poll, hear what your rights are, know what you can do, know what you might need help with, know what to ask. And that is different now. And so we need to make sure people know that, because one, so that they're actually able to successfully vote, and two, so that they don't end up missing out on the opportunity to vote because they think that this is the right way to do it, even though that's no longer the case. Our goal is also to educate people. As much as the governor's race might be what gets folks to the polls, we want to make sure people know about what other races are going on, and most importantly, how do those elected offices tie back to what people actually experience in their communities. We're nonpartisan, so we have faith that the candidate specific teams and campaigns will do their part in sharing why this candidate is better or worse for whatever issue. We need to make sure people understand what these roles are, and that gets missed a lot, especially in candidate campaigning. We want to make sure that people fundamentally understand what ties back to healthcare, what ties back to community health, safety, policing, what ties back to funding for communities, what roles play what type of impact into these different areas. And that's going to be a key part of our efforts. Making sure that people know about all of the different job opportunities that are going to come up this year in the civic engagement, voter engagement space, whether they're locally or party-based, whether they are organizationally based. We want to make sure that people are aware, not necessarily about a specific job, but that, hey, there's a whole new pool of opportunities that allow you to empower community members to participate. You can be a poll worker. Our digital and COVID conscious in-person get out the vote activities are still in the process of being planned. So we'll see what all we think is the most effective way to connect with folks. And also interestingly, I think as the last point is, this year, we really, really want to be flexible and ready and responsive to what is happening in the community, in the sense that COVID has shifted in terms of what the how communities are responding to it, whether they're out or not, or whether they're following certain protocols or precautions or not. And that means that we can't really just replay what we did last year since it was a different environment. And I think that just means being ready to be flexible. So that's all for now. Thank you.
Thank you. So I want to invite, I'll actually invite you both to just come on, and you can like leave your cameras on, and we'll just have a little conversation. There are some, a couple questions in the Q&A box and chat, and audience, please feel free to keep sending your questions. But I wanted to start by talking about voter education, which you both mentioned. And Cheryl, let's start with you. You mentioned that, you know, even if there's a small change, that can confuse voters. So, you know, how are you thinking about like the information that voters need right now in order to participate in 2022?
So that's a great question. We use a number of avenues and tactics to do that. We do it both online and offline, but one of the strategies that we're leaning on is relational organizing, because we know many voters are skeptical, they're confused, and so them having a trusted source, whether it's an organization like Democracy North Carolina, whether it's a family member or a leader or their faith center that they look to, having that information being provided by people they trust is really critical. So one of the things that we're going to use is what we call #WeVote. And we're actually going to ask our supporters to choose their starting 5 or their top 10 people that they're going to start from the very beginning, whether they're registered, they need to update their registration and go through the whole process. So we have that program. We're doing a program around emphasis on absentee voting and voting by mail that we're going to attach to that program. We're going to be working with faith ambassadors and faith centers, because again, it's about relationships. Then we had a slight dip with our supporters voting in 2020. We think there was confusion around, you know, how to get out, the safety around getting out, whether it was the pandemic or threats that people thought that were out there. And then also, of course, our nonprofit voter engagement program that we do in conjunction with Nonprofit Vote. So we're going to have a 4-tier system that we're using, but it is just so important that people are getting their information from the source that they trust. And with that, we're going to have resources that we're producing. We produce nonpartisan voter guides where we actually reach out to the candidates in selected cities and communities and areas across the state. And we actually ask them some burning issues and where they stand on the issues so that people can look and see what the candidates actually are saying on the issues that are most important to them. We also combine voter information in those guides. We do a wallet card where we try to break down some of the issues and share information so that people know how to vote, how to participate, whether it's early voting, whether they're going to do absentee, all the things that they need to know. Then we have what ncvoter.org, where everything that people need to know about voting in the upcoming election, we house it all there. And we ran in 2020 the largest election protection program. We had over 2,300 people on the ground at polling locations all across the state where we could help voters. We could find out what was your experience, but also help them to navigate any issues that we had. And we also have a hotline where people can call in toll free if they're having a problem, if they have a concern. They actually can call in today. Now, they won't get a live person like they will during the election time, but they can call in and ask questions and we will get back to them. And so we man that with our voting rights lawyers and experts to ensure that people feel heard and that they can resolve whatever their concerns are. So we're doing a number of things and we are just so excited. And we're also looking at possibly doing more radio ads. We do PSAs, but we actually want to do some radio ads because there are areas of North Carolina that are totally disconnected. They're in that digital divide, so they don't have a reliable internet. So they can't always join on Zooms. They may not even be able to see what we're talking about on social media, but there's a radio station that they listen to. So they're able to hear that. And we also are looking into putting up some billboards because one of the things we talked about is great to have that toll-free number at the voting location, but we want to meet people where they are in the community. We want them to know 888 our vote. We want them to be able to sing it. We want them to be able to rap it, whatever they need to do. We want them to know if I have a voting problem, I'm calling 888 our vote. So those are just some of the things. You can tell I'm really excited because I look at election season like football season. I'm a big sports fan, but I get so jazzed up about elections because this is where we get to talk. This is where, whether you have $1 million in your pocket or a penny, everybody's vote counts the same. And we want to make sure all people have access to the ballot.
Thank you. Yeah, so what I really heard clearly is that, yeah, people need to hear this information from trusted sources and that it's not just a one-time message. It's like, it's throughout the year, you know, making sure they're registered, making sure they know about the candidates on the ballot, making sure that, you know, they have that number that they can call when they are at the polls and having a problem or having a problem getting to the polls even. Kevin, you talked about, you know, that you can't just recycle the playbook from last year. So is there anything in particular that you are going to try to experiment with moving forward?
Sure. I think that one of the things that I was most excited about how ourselves and partner organizations approach voter empowerment last year was we had to, but also chose to really double down on the creativity of approaches, meaning that we had chalk art campaigns and spoken word poetry events focusing on civic and community engagement. And a lot of that came during and through the Senate runoffs, where we sort of took on this mandate to reach absolutely everybody possible in whatever way we could potentially connect with them. And I think, you know, it's when you're doing the work day in, day out, it's certainly easy to get into the habit of a few tried and true tactics, but in all likelihood at this stage, I'm not making an assumption that everyone has information, but many folks have access to information about what's happening, or at least a minimal level of awareness that there may be something coming down. And our role continues to increase to become galvanizing like their attention, like actually getting them to feel like there's something going on that they may want to connect with, or crossing over that information gap, whatever it may be, whether it's polling location. So one thing is definitely coming up with more creative ideas, and that may take the form of using arts, using community activities and engagement. It may be music, things like that. So excited about that. And I saw there was a question in the chat from Lisa. I'm happy to try to jump into that.
Yeah.
So let me read this quickly. Basically, I think, yeah. Can you please say more about the methods you found most successful for talking about the roles that people in elected offices play? I would say if you can, if you have the time, energy, budget to do this, trying to make it really local and really relevant to what's going on in communities, meaning that, hey, did you see this and that issue in the news? Or did you live in that neighborhood where something happened? This is the role that actually issues related to that roll up to. I think the more relevant you can make it, the less it feels abstract, because you can even tell people that, oh, the city government is responsible for potholes on your road. And that's kind of the sweet spot of, it's a little bit generic, but it's also something that people can immediately connect with and care about. And if you can find that line, or if you can go deeper into something that maybe something happened in your community or in your city or in your state, and so much has happened in the past couple of years that it's possible you'll be able to find things to connect with. In terms of actual content, we've done printed cards, because especially working with faith-based leaders, it's very easy to get those distributed out into the community, especially I see Cheryl nodding, like especially when you're talking about rural communities where access to the internet or Instagram, whatever your default is, may not be the same, and just being able to get folks to distribute printed materials is great. But also, yeah, like hop into Canva and make an Instagram slide and share that. And one thing we started doing, which seems to have been really helpful, is just anytime we share information, asking people as the first request, please share this with everybody you know. And I think just making that a very clear ask, especially when it came to election law changes, was helpful and I think important.
I love that. I feel like as a voter engagement field, we're really shifting from thinking about voting as this very individual behavior to something that can be very collective, and that we can engage our own networks and friends and family in it, rather than focusing on every single just one-to-one voter. It's like every voter that you talk to can like motivate 10 more people. And on that kind of hopeful note, I want to talk about, how do, in the face of, in both your states, voting can be fairly restrictive. Georgia's has a lot of new rules that make it harder. North Carolina, it feels like those rules come and go. There might not be great news about the map tomorrow. How do we keep people, and, I'd love to hear both organizers, but also voters, feeling hopeful when there's so much media attention and coverage on these negative things? So like, how do we combat that and keep people feeling excited and like, yes, their vote does count? Cheryl, would you like to start?
Sure. I really think it's incumbent upon us to keep that energy, to keep that motivation, because yes, we did not think we would be going to our third year of this pandemic. And we realize people are frustrated. We realize people are moving as it works for them in their risk tolerance. But it's just really up to us. So that's why when we can take some time to do the self-care, that we do that, because when it's time to go, it is time to go. And so we need to communicate the enthusiasm. We need to bring people in. So it's really up to those of us who really care about this franchise, who really care about voting, to ensure that, I don't want to overdo it, because my family can tell you, oh my God, if mom says one more time, or Auntie Cheryl says one more time, but they know I'm going to say it about 5 more times, that I need them to participate and to vote. And then I want their friends and their family to vote. And I'll take pictures and do all those things. So the enthusiasm is up to us. And that's where those conversations I was talking about are so critical, because we need help people to drown out the negativity, to drown out the noise, and sometimes just turn the TV off and unplug, because again, it is the trusted sources, whether it's an organization or it's your mom or it's your auntie, or it's your sister, or it's your brother. That's where you should be listening to the people who value this process and who value this work. So again, I know it's not easy. I've been in it for a minute. So we just have to keep our energy up. We have to keep doing the work. Like Kevin was talking about, the chalk art, TikToks. I mean, everything that we can use that's at our disposal. And I'm so excited because every year we do an internship, and this is our 23rd year. So when our friend turns, and that's what we call them, friends and interns, when they join us, we have them use this message, and then they take it back to their campuses. So it is so important that, especially me, in the generation that I'm in, that I pass the baton, that I am inspiring other people so that they can get excited and tell their friends. I know you may not think that casting that ballot makes a difference, but it does make a difference. If we want to talk about student debt, if we want to talk about livable wages, if we want to talk about affordable housing, those things don't happen in a vacuum. Somebody in a position of power makes those decisions. And if we're not voting, they're not hearing from us, and they're not going to bring about the changes and the laws that are going to work for all of us.
Thank you, Cheryl. Do you have anything to add to that, Kevin? How we stay motivated and hopeful?
I love that answer. I could not possibly add anything of value to that. Cheryl has re-inspired me, so I think that was great.
Well, good. Then I think that is an awesome note to leave it on. It is now 3:01, and my New Year's resolution is to make sure these end on time. 1 minute late is pretty good for me. So thank you so much, Kevin and Cheryl. Everyone who was on the webinar today will get a recording and slides of the webinar. And please fill out the brief little survey at the end when we turn this thing off. So follow us on social. And I hope you all have a great rest of your week, and we will see you on March 10th for America's Nonprofits Get Out the Vote. Bye.